Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this 11th meeting to discuss myths and mysteries of Egypt. This is the penultimate meeting, so let's begin with the commentary. In our fifth European cultural epoch, or the epoch of the consciousness soul, we are undergoing a recapitulation in a conscious form of the third Egypto-Chaldean cultural epoch. Just as the ancient Egyptians evolved the sentient soul by experiencing nature through sensory perceptions, now Europeans will evolve the consciousness soul only when they internalize in full consciousness this same experience of nature. Before, in ancient Egypt, nature came in the sentient souls from outside, so to speak, through sensory perceptions. Today, human beings become conscious once they internalize nature and place themselves in a conscious relationship with it. In other words, when they encounter nature in a movement that goes from within towards nature itself. In this way, we can say that they also provide nature with an I consciousness. This is all the more true today for the souls of the Italian people, who, as we know, are the reincarnation of the souls of ancient Egyptians, or rather, we can say that their last crucial incarnation was within the Egyptian people in the third cultural epoch. Furthermore, since our epoch of the consciousness soul is also the age of Pisces, we are reliving in a more conscious recapitulation after Christ, after the mystery of Golgotha, what occurred when the mass of the sun, with its hosts led by Christ, left the earth in the middle of the Hyperborean era. When the sun separated from earth, it entered the zodiacal region of Pisces. The Hyperborean era was precisely the age of Pisces, and the sun, shining through that zodiacal region, had given rise to the man-fish, and therefore to the evolutionary archetype of the fish themselves, as we have described in previous comments. So, in the age of Pisces, in the Hyperborean era, we have the process by which the sun moves away from the earth in the forces that allow the evolution of the upper half of man, related as a polarity to its lower half. Here the man-fish comes into being. In the current age of Pisces, in the post-Atlantean era, the Christ united instead with the earth in what we call the forces of resurrection. So you can see that there is a polarity if we want to relate the age of Pisces of the Hyperborean era to the age of Pisces of our post-Atlantean era. And that just as humanity then had lived with nostalgia the departure of Christ from the earth with the mass of the sun and its hosts, so humanity today can choose to unite enthusiastically with Christ in the event of the mystery of Golgotha, in which the Christ united with the evolution of the earth and its hosts. So, in fact, in the Hyperborean era, there is a departure of Christ into the sphere of the sun, while in our era there is a coming closer of the Christ to the earth from the sphere of the sun. You understand that this is precisely polarity situated then and now exactly in the age of Pisces, bearing in mind that the fourth cultural epoch, the Greco-Roman epoch, stands on its own, so to speak. It is the pivot of the cosmic balance of time and is divided into two halves, one before and one after Christ. Now, in a similar way, the second cultural epoch, the Paleo-Persian, will be recapitulated in a conscious form in the next cultural epoch, the sixth, the Russian Slavic epoch, or epoch of the spiritual self. This will take place within the forces of the zodiacal region of Aquarius. In the same way, the first Paleo-Indian cultural epoch will be recapitulated in conscious form in the future seventh cultural epoch, the American epoch, or of the life spirit, within the forces of the zodiacal region of Capricorn. After that, following the war of all against all, we will enter the forces of Sagittarius. So, just as Steiner told us about the physical evolution of man from the separation of the sun in the Hyperborean era through Lemuria to Atlantis, in the same way initially the same zodiacal regions are retraced in a totally unconscious form. If you remember, he talked about Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn, Sagittarius, and then went on to talk about Scorpio, Libra, and Virgo. So after the Christ, we are reliving this time in a fully conscious form the zodiacal forces that went from Pisces to the higher signs, so towards Libra. Thus, in the sixth epoch, we will consciously relieve the forces of Aquarius, in the seventh those of Capricorn, and the apocalyptic eras will begin with Sagittarius, and so on, always moving towards the higher part of the zodiac, so to speak, beyond Libra. We can understand in this way how the experiences of our souls in ancient Egyptian civilization are resurrecting in a more conscious form in the experience of our souls that are incarnated today. I have spoken extensively about this on our trip to Egypt, so I invite you, if you're interested in Egyptian myths, to listen to the recordings of the trip to Egypt. Today, we can bring to consciousness the experiences that our souls have lived through in an ancient Egyptian civilization. Before, we experienced nature in our senses in the sentient soul. Now, we can experience nature in the consciousness soul by encountering it consciously, and in this encounter, forming an inner image of it. What happened in Egyptian times is thus reversed in our present age, so that we become conscious of what then lived in the perceptions of the senses. The ancient Egyptians developed the sentient soul through the senses. We, the Italian people, or in a broader sense, we Europeans, develop the consciousness soul in this encounter with nature in the world. We could call it a clash encounter sometimes, as we know. At the center of this reversal lies the mystery of the incarnation of the Christ, with the mystery of Golgotha, which is its consequence and its completion, because Christ incarnates completely at the moment he experiences death in the body of Jesus on the cross. This event was of fundamental importance not only for the souls incarnated in the fourth epoch who were alive, so not only for the living, but also for the dead. Steiner will talk about this in more detail later in this lecture. In fact, we know that the third Egypto-Chaldean cultural epoch is also a recapitulation of the events of the Lemurian era, in the sense that the experience of the souls of the Lemurian era before and after the detachment of the moon, which Steiner has already described, became the teachings of the initiates of the Egyptian mysteries. And in fact, the Egyptian initiate, in the initiation ceremony of mystical death, entered into communion with the gods. These gods have animal heads and can take on animal features, precisely because in the Lemurian era, human beings were going through their animal stage of evolution. Why do we see in particular these gods in animal form? Precisely because, being the third cultural epoch, a recapitulation on a higher, more conscious state of the Lemurian era, in the Lemurian era, human beings were passing through their animal stage. So the deities who came into contact with humans took on the form that they could best assume in order to approach humans. Therefore, the animal form, which then resurfaced in the Egypto-Chaldean epoch as a memory from the Lemurian era. As human souls descended into matter, and here Steiner is recapitulating everything he has already described, they lost the ability to have experiences between death and rebirth. The post-mortem world, the post-mortem life gradually became identified with the underworld as we go from the Egyptian epoch to the Greco-Roman epoch. And the more the interest in the physical world grew, the more the consciousness of the supersensible worlds became obscured. In particular, the consciousness of the Devachan, the spiritual world. The culmination of this process occurred precisely in the fourth Greco-Roman epoch. Thus, the initiation process served to return to the perception of the worlds and the subtle bodies of the occult constitution. It was therefore necessary to help people perceive more intensely what was gradually being lost by the majority of humanity. Today, we perceive very little of what happens during the night. This is because we are immersed in sleep. Why is this? Why do we not perceive so much? Because we do not have astral body organs that are sufficiently developed to perceive continuously as the physical organs do when we are awake. We do have these organs, but they are still in a developing germinal embryonic state. So, just as organs for physical perception have developed in the physical body, organs for supersensible perception must also develop in the astral body. These organs are the lotus flowers or chakras. How can these organs for supersensible perception develop within the astral body? This becomes possible through the practice of occultic exercises and meditation given to disciples of Western esotericism. The occult exercises and the meditations, which we can specify as imaginative meditation, only work in a healthy way if they are done with devotion. Without the element of devotion, they still work, so to speak, on the supersensible organs of the astral body, but in a one-sided and therefore unbalanced way. On the other hand, the element of devotion creates the right conditions for these organs to develop in a balanced and regular way. But the exercises alone would not be enough, nor would meditation. Because both occult exercises and meditation must go hand in hand with the body of knowledge. This body of knowledge in the form of images are those images that the initiates have previously acquired, discovered, we might say, and internalized from their investigations of the supersensible worlds through their own experiences. Everything that has been experienced in the history of esotericism by previous initiates is not lost. Imagine that it gradually settles and becomes part of the tradition of Western esotericism, or rather, the Western tradition of the mysteries. This becomes the reserve, so to speak, the treasure trove that we can access together with occult exercises and imaginative meditation to then be able to take the step beyond the threshold. Therefore, we can say that three inner activities are essentially required. One is the practice of exercises and meditation, then devotion, then knowledge. These three, as you will have understood, are a form of activity. One of the will, which are the exercises and meditation, one of feeling, which is devotion, and one of thought, which is knowledge. The treasure trove of the ancient initiates, of the previous initiates. The union of knowledge of the supersensible worlds with the practice of exercises and meditation, together with devotion, allow us to develop organs of supersensible perception. This path of initiation that we know from the esoteric lessons GA 266, and many of you have done it together with us, this path of initiation proceeds in stages, so that consciousness can gradually expand and knowledge can give us an orientation in the new worlds that are gradually revealed to this expanded consciousness. It is the overcoming of the so-called no-passing rings, that is, of the limits of consciousness. This happens in stages because, in fact, if it all happened at once, it would lead to overload, it would lead to madness. On an unhealthy esoteric path, when, for example, the exercises are not practiced according to the instructions given by the initiate, or there is no devotion, and on the contrary, there is pride, there are all these luciferic tendencies. If knowledge is not firmly established, what happens is that the consciousness tends to expand not by degrees, but by irregular leaps. In this way, when it is invaded by supersensible perceptions, it gradually leads to dissociation, to a form of alienation, and to an inflation of what in psychology is usually called the unconscious, which brings to the consciousness a whole series of images that are not consciously processed. And this leads or can lead to states that are so altered that they can be called spiritual madness. Therefore, if the above process does not happen gradually, it tends to disrupt our interiority, the experience of the individual consciousness. One becomes submerged by this image, so it is important that all three spheres are activated and balanced with each other. Exercise and meditation, that is will, feeling, devotion, and thought, knowledge. Because this happens by degrees, an initiatory school will have degrees. So why do all initiatory schools and everything in Western esotericism, but also in Eastern esotericism, have degrees? Because degrees represent stages of expansion of consciousness, which can be symbolic, and yet, by working in the manner described with will, feeling, and thinking, through exercises, devotion, and knowledge, become real. At the symbolic level, let us say, the symbol is activated and becomes like a door for the expansion of consciousness, and as a result, a state of real initiation is reached degree by degree. During the day, human beings allow the impressions of the external physical senses, which are directed toward the external world, to act upon them. This allows us to operate in the physical world. So the physical senses, let's say the external physical senses, allow us to operate in the physical world. However, these impressions, think for example of touch, sight, hearing, taste, smell, all five senses, do not remain in the sense organs, but extend and infuse the subtle bodies, extend into the astral body, which in turn extends them to the eye. The more external these physical impressions are, and the less the eye consciousness is able to understand them consciously, the more they damage the etheric body. Therefore, all the experiences of the physical world that we have through the senses and that we are unable to bring to consciousness invade the astral body and pass from the astral body to the etheric body, damaging it. This damage to the etheric body corresponds to the fatigue we feel growing from the beginning of the day until we go to sleep at night. The more tired we are, the more this means we have, so to speak, stimulated the astral body and the etheric body through the senses, without having been able, at least not consistently, to bring to consciousness what we have experienced through the senses. What happens then? These physical impressions, being physical, they do not stay on that moment of falling asleep. That is, when the astral body and the eye leave the physical etheric body. Why? Because the astral body and the eye go to the higher worlds. They go to the etheric region, then to the astral region, then to the lower and higher Devakan, until the cosmic midnight. And then they return to the physical etheric body. It is different, however, if one practices occult exercises and imaginative meditation, because then the astral body, conforming more and more to its organs, does not lose its experiences and tends to preserve them. This is because from them the spiritual substance is extracted that forms the astral body. A spiritual extract of the sensory experiences is created. The astral body is then formed and organized into organs, just as the physical body was formed by physical impressions. Organs of supersensible perception are formed, which remain in an embryonic state for a certain time when the astral body returns to the etheric body at the moment of awakening. The formative processes of the organs of the astral body are then imprinted as if on a seal in the etheric body. And here Steiner says this is how one arrives at what is called enlightenment. This means that where before there was no supersensible perception, now there is. A light shines in the darkness. In the initiations before Christ, the astral body had the power to act on the etheric body only when it was extracted from the physical body through the process of mystical death. The candidate to the Egyptian mysteries, or more generally, the microcosmic mysteries, remained for 3.5 days in a state of coma close to death, induced by the Hierophant. Then the etheric body was almost completely freed from the physical body, and in this way was impressed as if on a seal by the astral body. The astral body then imprinted on the etheric body what had been formed within it through occult exercises and imaginative meditation. For example, you may remember Steiner speaking of the meditation that was given on the countenance and figure of man in order to form the man who was still in an animal stage in the Atlantean era. This happened because the etheric body was so closely connected to the physical body that it offered greater resistance to the impressions of the astral body. And this process of the etheric body attaching itself to the physical body continued until the arrival of the Christ, until the mystery of Christ's incarnation and at the baptism in the Jordan. When the Hierophant awakened the initiate from his sleep, the initiator woke enlightened and remembered what he had experienced in the supersensible worlds. He then had knowledge through direct experience of the ancient evolutionary processes living in the myths, for example, of Osiris, Isis, and Horus, that the initiate could then recount in imaginative form in myths to the rest of humanity, to those who were not initiated into the mysteries, to the profane. In particular, as Steiner will tell us here in more detail, it was through the ancient evolutionary processes that it was possible to trace creation back to what it was, with all its kingdoms of nature, the animal, the vegetable, and the mineral, when these were still within man, and when the moon was still within the earth, and the sun was still within the earth. He experienced how the moon separated from the earth and how Osiris mediated between the earth and the sun. He experienced how Horus was generated by the union of Isis and Osiris, and experienced the gods and their relationships in their own evolution. He also saw how souls ascend to the celestial spheres and then return to earth with a new birth, a reincarnation. They also could see the evolution of the four group souls of humanity: Taurus, Leo, Eagle, and the countenance of man. He then saw the Sphinx, the union of these four group souls, in which the group souls of humanity were united, and he heard the enigmatic question that corresponded to the evolution of the human form from the animal stage. He saw how the etheric body first emerged from its animal stage in the region of the Sphinx head, which has a human face. It was being prepared to receive the human eye in incarnation. What would happen in the future? So the initiate had direct knowledge of the gods and their evolution, and knew that the gods were at different stages of evolution. He was therefore able not only to know how the realms of nature had separated from man, and thus how man had evolved, but also how the gods had evolved. Some of the gods went through evolution together with the human beings, but without descending so low into earthly matter. Steiner gave the example of Wotan. Other gods, on the other hand, were further along in their evolution and completed their evolution in higher spheres of consciousness than those on earth, such as Osiris and Isis. Going back to the Lemurian era, he was able to see how the human etheric body had not yet taken on a human form, but was still animal, so that when the gods descended to earth and could only incarnate up to the etheric body, they had to take on an animal form. The gods who had united themselves with human and earth evolution at the time of the departure of sun and moon had to take on an animal form in order to manifest themselves in such a way that the third cultural epoch was a recapitulation of the Lemurian era in a new form. This is why Egyptian initiates experienced the gods in animal form or with the head of an animal. The gods appeared as they had appeared to humanity in the Lemurian era. What does this mean? The Egyptian gods showed themselves in the form appropriate to the corresponding animal group spirits that had been generated when human beings were going through the same stage of evolution. For example, we have retraced the stages of the bull, the lion, the eagle, and the man. But if you remember, we also spoke of an earlier stage than that of the bull, which is that of the amphibian and the reptile. So we have fish, amphibians, reptiles, and later mammals and birds. This is because, though the four group souls are the prevailing ones, man went through all the stages that we then find in animals. The ancient Egyptians then saw the gods who had approached man in the Lemurian era and who had allowed, on the one hand, man to take on that animal form, and on the other, the animals, detaching that archetype of man, to take it upon themselves, fixing themselves in that stage. We already saw all this in this image that compares the supersensible evolution of the human being with the sense-physical evolution of animals, or rather, of a part of animals. Not all animals are there, only the main ones are mentioned, but this is just for the sake of a clearer representation. In reality, we should imagine all animals and also all plants and all minerals that evolved in earlier spirals than the one you see here. Gradually moving towards the Atlantean era, the deities took on a form that from animal became increasingly human. This was because they went hand in hand with the formation of the human being. They came closer and closer to the human being. They formed it. So initially, let's say in the Polarian era, they were in the forms of minerals. Then they took the form of plants in the Hyperborean era, animals in the Lemurian era, and gradually became humans in the Atlantean era. So much so that in the various religions of the world, you will find deities that have, we might say, their mineral, plant, animal, and human representations. We're speaking of all the religions of the world. So, for example, among the ancient Romans who gathered in Rome all the cults of humanity in which the Roman Empire had expanded, one finds deities that appear in mineral form. For example, the Betili, divine stones, then others that appear in vegetable form, for example, trees, shrubs, herbs, flowers, etc. Others that appear as animals, the guardian animals of the deities, and then they also have a human form. In this, we find the whole series that goes all the way from the Polarian era to the Hyperborean, Lemurian, Atlantean to post-Atlantean. So the animal forms separated, and the same goes for all kingdoms of nature, though here we're focusing on animals. Animal forms separated first from human beings, sacrificing themselves so that human beings could attain their own form. Looking at animals, then, we see past stages of human evolution that have become fixed in the sense physical realm. Archetypes of animals have been generated by the fact that human beings have expelled those forms that were no longer suitable for their evolution in the different stages they have gone through. In this way, we can say that the form of the human physical body was shaped by losing and expelling animal forms in order to finally be able to incarnate the spirit that is the human eye. For this reason, the eye corresponding to animals cannot totally incarnate within them, precisely because they do not have a life form suitable for it. It remains outside of them. The exception lies in some domestic animals, in some social animals, which, even though they have an animal form, the eye is able to touch more closely, so to speak, and therefore they actually gain a sort of prophetic individuality. Another exception we mentioned to illustrate this image are anthropomorphic monkeys who, despite having an animalized body, are in fact human souls that have been left far behind for having assumed upon them all lunar dross, always during the Lemurian era. And then they will manifest, as you can see from this image, in the Atlantean era. They will crystallize, so to speak, they will enter, they will appear in the physical evolution in the Atlantean era. The animal forms, therefore, as they descended into the sense physical realm in evolution, became fixed in a corresponding past stage of human evolution. Then they became increasingly crystallized, generating other derivative forms in the course of evolution, which are nevertheless always in relation to their same archetype. We must imagine that in the stages of human evolution, animal archetypes are generated, And from these archetypes, life forms are generated, which are, we might say, forms that specify a certain life form of that archetype. We have to imagine that the archetype is something greater, closer to the spiritual archetype. It is in the spirit. And then from this derive forms of life that descend into the sense physical world and specify how that spiritual archetype will manifest in the sense physical world. We must also understand that these past evolutionary archetypes always exist in the astral and etheric worlds, with all their different forms. So much so that, and Steiner gives an example in this lecture, by ascending in meditation to the supersensible world, it is possible to encounter beings that are usually described in myths and legends, such as the Sphinx, which is a residual image in the etheric astral world of human evolution in those earlier stages. Or, for example, the dragon or other mythological beings. All these beings are in fact forms in the making that have been passed in the descent from the spiritual world to the sense physical world between humans and animals and other kingdoms of nature, and that have remained fixed as etheric astral images. We can say that they are etheric astral fossils, so to speak. In the same way, we can encounter in the etheric astral world the supersensible forms of animals, plants, and minerals that are now extinct and belong to the corresponding evolutionary lines of animals in earlier stages, following this differentiation pattern from an archetype to life forms. So keep in mind that in the supersensible worlds, everything that has existed and will exist continues to exist in a totality. And even the forms that no longer appear in space-time in a sense physical manifestation can be encountered here, particularly as residual forms, residual images of the etheric astral world. This will be, for example, the way in which Goethe investigated the metamorphosis of plants precisely by perceiving through his observations what the plants were in metamorphosis in the etheric astral. Others, for example, Ernst Haeckel, Steiner talks about this in his autobiography, did the same, in particular with animal forms. In the middle of the Lemurian era, when human beings first set foot on Earth, they consisted of a physical, etheric, and astral body, which continued to develop and gave birth, so to speak, to the corresponding forms of nature. Later, and we are in the events described in Genesis about halfway through the Lemurian era, the spirits of form, or Elohim, the hierarchy of the sun, which had already reached the stage of creator gods by virtue of a previous evolution, conferred the eye on human beings. They took a part of their own substance and gave it to man, thus making him a true human being, or at least giving him the potential to become a true human being. Until then, they had a mineral physical body, a plant etheric body, and an animal astral body. From the second half of the Lemurian era, animals have the potential to become true human beings to the extent that they progressively live in the forces of the eye. However, as we know, there were also other entities that, during the previous evolutions of ancient Saturn, Sun, and Moon, had not become creator gods, but rather, we might say, molders, shapers. They were able to shape, in a certain sense, the substances of the astral, etheric, and physical, but not to create. Precisely for this reason, having been left behind and not having developed creative powers, even though they could have done so progressively, they became in many ways parasites of the human being. In particular, Steiner speaks here of the Luciferic spirits that were active in the middle of the Lemurian era, the Luciferic spirits that had remained behind an ancient moon in particular. What does it mean? That in their being, in their state of consciousness, they could only continually recapitulate the lunar revolution, or they had fallen behind. When they had fallen behind, and thus work in a formative way on the human astral body. What was the formative action? They entered the human astral body and instilled cravings, the karma, which therefore came not from regular spirits, but from irregular spirits. If the Luciferic spirits, let us say, had acted in this way on the moon, when their evolution was still regular, their action would have been evolutionary. But by carrying out this formative work on Earth in a stage subsequent to that of ancient moon, their action became a temptation. The temptation to return to the stage of the ancient moon in an irregular form. In this way, that the astral body was made to regress by being infused with retrograde forces, that is, with instincts, with craving, and above all, with selfishness. This regression also extended from the astral body to the etheric body. The latter became denser and opened the door to the Ahrimanic spirits. Finally, the regression extended to the physical body, which then became increasingly caught up in the forces of the outer world and thus opened the door to the Asuric spirits. The Ahrimanic spirits remained behind on ancient sun and continued to act in a retrograde manner on the etheric body. And the Asuric spirits remained behind an ancient Saturn and acts in a retrograde manner on the physical body. Now, this is only to give a reference. We will not go in depth into these other two hierarchies of the obstacle. So what did the Luciferic spirits do? By instilling craving in the astral body, an increasingly intense identification with the physical body alone took place, because the physical body was what was needed to satisfy the instincts, cravings, and selfishness that now lived in the astral body. At that point, man began his descent deeper and deeper into materiality and personality, and for the first time, disease arose. A breach opened up in the human being to generate disease, that is, the imbalance between the astral, etheric, and physical bodies in relation to the I. Disease is the infusion of the Luciferic influence of craving into the astral body. That influence is then imprinted from the astral to the etheric and finally to the physical body, also generating the possibility of inheriting diseases or a predisposition to disease. We're talking about internal diseases, endogenous diseases that are inherent in the etheric body as genetic predisposition, we would say today. Genes are nothing more than an external manifestation of the etheric body. The disease is ultimately expressed in the physical body. Just as the human body weakened from within, becoming, so to speak, increasingly susceptible to endogenous diseases, so too did it become increasingly exposed to external dangers, because it lost its instinct for what is healthy and what is not, closing in on itself more and more. In this way, human beings became increasingly exposed to both internal, endogenous, and external, exogenous dangers. This is the beginning of illness, which opens the door to death brought about by the Ahrimanic spirits. However, as long as human beings remained in the supersensible worlds, they were one with the gods, and so human beings lived in the highest and most subtle stages of substance, heat, gas, the air part, and liquid, the watery part. We can also say fire, air, and water. As long as human beings remained in this dimension of heat, gas, and liquid, in these three higher states, it was possible for other beings to pass through them by being breathed in, inhaled, and exhaled. So, as long as human beings remain in the supersensible fabric in heat, gas, air, and liquid, they are permeable and can be passed through by other beings. Then, little by little, human beings separated themselves from their union with the gods. They descended, were born from the womb of the gods, and the further they descended into matter, the more nature took on the form we know, itself gradually evolving. As human beings incarnated as I in a physical body, so did the kingdoms of nature evolve into the life forms we know, also passing through past life forms, the history of the earth. First, there was only the spiritual human being, and from this the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, and the mineral kingdom differentiated. Here lies the secret of initiatory medicine, which the ancient Egyptians had a great mastery of. They were known to be great doctors because they understood how the animal, plant, and mineral kingdoms were specifically connected to the human being. The animal kingdom originates from the soul of the human being. The plant kingdom originates from the vital, physiological life processes of the human being. And the mineral kingdom originates from the processes specific to the physical form of the human being. These are manifested externally in the macrocosm. Thus, the principle of healing in initiatory medicine, of which the Egyptians were great connoisseurs and exponents, derived from their knowledge of the occult relationship between human beings and the kingdoms of nature. When human beings experience an imbalance in their astral and etheric bodies, which then manifests in the physical body, it is in fact possible to restore balance by compensating for certain processes that have become too weak or conversely too strong, by taking remedies formed from the corresponding realms of nature. If the imbalance is in the astral body, the remedies that can strengthen or weaken, depending on the process to be worked on, will come from the animal kingdom or from the animal parts that are present, for example, in the plant kingdom, and in a certain form from the astral parts of the mineral kingdom. In the same way, therefore, if there is an imbalance that has reached the etheric body, where will we find the remedy? Mainly in the more etheric parts of the animal kingdom, but above all in the plant kingdom and in the more etheric parts of the mineral kingdom. But above all, I repeat, in the plant kingdom, which is, so to speak, the externalization of the human etheric in the world, just as animals are the externalization of the human astral in the world. Consequently, if this imbalance has manifested in the physical body, the remedies will mainly be minerals. Therefore, they will be the mineral part of the animal kingdom, the mineral part of the plant kingdom, or the more mineral part of the animal and plant kingdom, and the mineral kingdom. If you think about it, medicines, as we understand them in allopathic medicine, are basically nothing more than crystalline or crystallized or freeze-dried forms, therefore rendered as crystals, rendered as sand, even if compacted, so to speak, mineralized, of the substances. And in fact, these act on the physical body in high doses of the active ingredient, and only indirectly on the etheric body and possibly on the astral body. Whereas if we use remedies that are plant-based, they will act mainly on the etheric body and animal remedies mainly on the astral body. Always bearing in mind that animals, plants, and minerals all have astral, etheric, and physical parts, even if, of course, they have a greater possibility of action in one of these three spheres, of the three dimensions of the human being, and therefore also of the world. What does this mean? How can we imagine the astral body of the earth? We can imagine it when we see the movement of animals and their breathing of air in the atmosphere, i.e. the aerial part. How can we see the etheric body of the earth? In everything that is liquid, so the hydrosphere in a broad sense, including the part of the hydrosphere that evaporates into the atmosphere and in the plant kingdom. How can we see the physical body of the earth? We see it when we look at minerals, at the geological part, the geosphere, with everything that exists in the solid state of minerals, even if they exist also in other states. It is always more complex. You must always imagine that everything exists in everything, but that in order to describe it, we try to simplify without distorting it. The secret to healing is to understand whether a process of imbalance is excessive or deficient, where this mainly acts whether in the astral, etheric, or physical, and to which one or more remedy from the animal, plant, and mineral kingdoms, from which part of the animal, plant, and mineral kingdoms does it correspond. The imbalance can then be acted upon by intensifying attenuation, cooling, or warming, thanks to substances derived from animals, plants, and minerals and their parts. In this way, with these remedies, the original unity of the human being is restored to its equilibrium. Unity is restored to the human being in soul, life, and body, in the astral, etheric, and physical. This is, in essence, the principle of initiatory medicine, and anthroposophical medicine is fundamentally based on this principle, which Steiner describes here, talking about the medicine of the ancient Egyptians, as well as in a broader sense of natural healing understood in an anthroposophical sense that we can call anthroposophical naturopathy, or, in a word, naturosophia. I spoke about it years ago, and perhaps we will have occasion to do so again. So, following these principles, the initiatory medicine practiced by the ancient Egyptians was very profound and was still a sacred science that is connected to the gods. So it was the gods who taught humanity about these connections through the experience of the deities in initiation. Doctors were initiates. Their disciples, in order to be able to practice medicine, which was initiatory and a sacred science, had to be initiated. And there were specific initiations into certain deities who taught some particular aspects of medicine. For example, aspects that had to do with the etheric body and which, as we have said, have to do with the constitution of the physiological processes that take place in the element that flows continuously, which is the etheric body that pulsates, that flows like a water cycle, was the god Sobek, the crocodile god. He was the one who, in the myth of Osiris, Isis, and Horus, once Isis had reassembled the pieces of Osiris' body, allowed them to be infused with the formative forces of the waters of the Nile. The crocodile, as ruler of the waters of the Nile, brought the etheric force to reassemble the pieces of Osiris' body into a single body, restoring the unity of his physiological processes that occur precisely where there is water or liquid. So, in the temple of Sobek, one came to know in particular the principles of medicine that brought balance to the etheric body. There were other deities who were more concerned with the physical body and other deities who were more concerned with the astral body. So, an initiate in Egyptian medicine had different experiences, different initiations that corresponded to the temples of different deities who taught him different, let's say, methods, techniques. But it was not only that, it was a real experience of what linked a process of imbalance to a corresponding process of balance between the unbalanced man and the substances and nature that could rebalance him. The initiates had not only knowledge but also experience of the occult connection between individual organs and life processes and the substances of nature. And in fact, through initiation, they traced back the stages of evolution in which the kingdoms of nature had become detached from the human being. Thus, they knew exactly the hidden correspondence between organs and the animals, plants, and minerals. Lo and behold, they are called organisms, meaning formed by organs, that corresponding to an organ and its life processes. They thus retrace the evolutionary lines that led from man to nature and from nature to man. They knew how to bring their consciousness to these two poles, man, nature, nature, man. They knew how to travel along all these paths that branched out and gave rise to the kingdoms of nature as we know them, and to man as we know him, with his systems of organs corresponding to organisms existing in nature. And they knew how to extract and prepare substances from the three kingdoms of nature that could act in a compensatory way with regard to life processes. For example, they had knowledge of metals, which are, we might say, the most astral part of the mineral kingdom. This knowledge of metals, for example, reappeared in a more conscious form in Paracelsus, who was the first to bring this knowledge of metals, which he himself had learned in Egypt from what remained of this ancient initiatory wisdom, into form suitable for the European people. Over time, this knowledge became part of folk medicine or folk healing. Why? Because the souls that were incarnated at the time of the ancient Egyptians and who therefore experienced to a certain degree a form of initiation of worship and experienced these healing processes for themselves returned to incarnation in Europe. This gave rise to thoughts derived from the experience of incarnation in ancient Egypt. About this, Steiner also makes a very interesting observation because he says that this applies not only to the medical field, but also to the philosophical and scientific fields, such as Darwin's theory of evolution. So we're talking about, let's say, roughly half a century before the time when Steiner was speaking. Shortly before this theory of evolution had finally been proposed, which gave a unified picture of the enormous wealth of knowledge that existed about the kingdoms of nature, in particular of animals and plants, and the thought arises that within Darwin's theory of evolution, our ancestors took on animal forms. This, though, is understood only in a materialistic and external sense, and it is forgotten that it was the gods who took on animal forms and that these formed the supersensible human being. The human being, in its essence, is not found in the physical, etheric, and astral, but in the I. So the physical, the etheric, and the astral were formed from minerals, from the outflow of minerals, the etheric from the outflow of plants, and the astral from the outflow of animals. But the I, the human being, was not formed from animals, plants, and minerals. It was formed by the gods. They placed it in a body that gradually took on mineral forms and plant forms, and then when it was animal, was ready to receive this eye, which, however, hovered above it. And as the animals with their forms emerged from the human being, the eye was finally able to incarnate in a human form suitable for this spiritual event. In fact, what we see is that we forget that it was the gods who took on an animal form and that they formed the supersensible human being, and it is from the latter that the sense physical animals gradually derived. So, if anything, the process is inverted. In the beginning, there was the spiritual human being, and gradually the physical forms of the animals became apparent. Okay, sorry, I'm having trouble viewing this file, so I'll reopen it. Here it is. Every thought that arises today in a materialistic sense must be spiritualized through the impulse of Christ. Steiner says that it is true that thoughts are resurrecting today in a materialistic sense. Thoughts that were supersensible experiences in Egyptian times. However, after Christ, it is possible to spiritualize these same materialistic thoughts, or rather, to resurrect human thought from the tomb of materialism. This impulse of Christ, and here I would like to underscore that Steiner repeatedly calls this the Palestine event, was important on the physical plane as well as in the supersensible worlds, as much for souls incarnated on earth as for souls living between death and rebirth. In fact, during the descent of the human being before Christ, selfishness had grown to such an extent that the eye was excessively imprinted in the blood. We know that blood, on the other hand, is the external physical expression of the eye. It is the vehicle of the eye in the physical world. You must imagine this excess of selfishness as if it saturated all the blood. It had to be thrown out of the physical body, expelled from the human soul, if it wanted to reunite with the supersensible worlds in its ascension, that is, backward towards the spiritual world. This was made possible through the mystery of Golgotha, so that the blood shed by Christ Jesus on the cross had an effect in all worlds, both for the living and for the dead. And for this reason, he also takes on the title of Christ Jesus, the Redeemer. The blood of Christ Jesus flowed into the material world in such a way that, imagine, the excess of selfishness overflowed into the spiritual world. Selfishness was thus redeemed in love for one's neighbor, which has since spread in ever wider circles. These circles will reach their full extent in the ages after Christ. We're living in the first epoch after the fourth. We are in the fifth epoch, so the Christ comes about halfway through the fourth cultural epoch. There is half of the fourth epoch after Christ. It ends in 1413, and then our cultural epoch begins, the fifth. So these circles will come in the course of the epochs after Christ to embrace not only humanity as our neighbor, but progressively also those kingdoms of nature that have fallen away from humanity, the animals, plants, and minerals, the whole earth, and thus the body of Christ, and even the entire cosmos, therefore the celestial spheres, the stars, up to the zodiac. You must therefore imagine that this love for one's neighbor, which must begin in the human being, in humans understanding themselves as incarnated spirits who are having a human experience, but who are spirits incarnated in human bodies, must then expand in ever wider circles that include animals, plants, minerals, the whole earth understood as the body of Christ, and finally the whole cosmos up to the zodiac. Everything that constituted the limit of ancient Saturn, our no-passing ring, our maximum limit of consciousness, which in this sequence of planetary incarnations, from ancient Saturn to the future Vulcan, we cannot pass. We will be able to do so, but in a planetary chain subsequent to this one, obviously following the regular evolution. Christ Jesus lay dead for 3.5 days. Christ experienced death for 3.5 days in the body of Jesus in a form that recapitulated on a higher arc. We can call it divine precisely because Christ is a God. What happened in prophetic form to the initiates in the mystical death that was experienced in the ancient Egypt in the mysteries of the Way of the South. Just as the initiate could awaken from initiation by saying to himself, as Steiner reports here, death can be overcome, in the world the eternal exists. In an even greater arc, the Spirit of the Son, the Christ, conquered death in such a way that what had already happened in occult form in the mysteries became a manifest historical event. What was previously reserved for his initiates began to open up as a possibility for all humanity. And in this renewal of the initiation of the ancient mysteries, the Christ spiritually conquered death even on the physical plane. The initiate could then say to the incarnated souls of human beings, these are words reported by Steiner, I know that there is a spiritual world in which it is possible to live. I lived in that world for 3.5 days, and I bring you news of it. I bring you gifts from the spiritual world. However, this ancient initiate could not speak in the same way to the deceased, to whom he could only say, everything that happens in the material world is such that man should be liberated. Life is suffering, and only liberation is their salvation. He also said we can only reap the fruits of the spirits in the material world. It was only through the mystery of Golgotha that death was conquered in the physical world, in such a way that this evolutionary process involved both the living and the dead, both the incarnate and the disincarnate. The more the impulse of Christ was experienced in life, the more the consciousness of the spiritual worlds was illuminated. Where previously the spiritual worlds had become only shadows, the underworld. This is why the Christian descended among the dead during these 3.5 days in which he experienced death, thus ascending to the ancient evolution within the inner layers of the earth. So he visits the bowels of the earth, going backwards to revisit what had been gradually obscured about past evolution, the consciousness that was previously present in the higher worlds and that had gradually shrunk, Earth, Mars, ancient Moon, ancient Sun, ancient Saturn. The Christ then visiting the bowels of the earth recapitulates in reverse the earthly evolution from the event of Golgotha, the Earth Mars, the ancient Moon, ancient Sun, ancient Saturn, which corresponds to what surrounds the core of the Earth, illuminating the corresponding supersensible worlds with his very presence, the I Am. He is the I Am. I am the I Am. The descent of the I Am in the bowels of the earth brings the light of consciousness in the etheric world, in the astral world, in the lower Devachan and in the higher Devachan, which correspond to the evolution that goes from the Earth Mars to ancient Saturn. At the same time, this event illuminates the souls of the deceased who are in this kingdom of shadow, in this life post-death, between death and a new rebirth, which was spent entirely in unconsciousness. As the Christ descended, he brought the I Am to the center of the earth, where it placed the seed of sun, so that earth itself may in the future Venus, become a sun shining from within. Meanwhile, as he descended into the bowels of the earthquakes mentioned in the Gospels occurred. The earth is shaken, the entire planet is shaken by earthquakes that are like these tremors of the descent of the I Am within the bowels of the earth, until it reaches the center of the earth. The Christ descended among the dead, therefore, and announced to them, a bit like for the initiates before. Now Steiner tells us what the Christ announced to the dead. On earth, something has happened that removes the possibility of saying that what happens there is less important than what happens here. Thanks to that event, man is able to bring a gift from the physical world into the spiritual realm. So something happened on the physical plane that can finally act in a liberating way in the spiritual world, in the supersensible worlds. In particular, death has been conquered in the material world, so that even in the supersensible worlds, in the spiritual world, the light of consciousness is brought. Once again, this visit to the bowels of the earth corresponds to an expansion of consciousness in the higher worlds. In the esoteric Christian sense, this is precisely the good news that Christ announced to the dead during his descent into the underworld in the death of the earth. Through these 9 layers plus the core, the 10th, inside the core of the earth, the heart of the earth. So, the human being has descended all the way into the death of the physical body, of materiality, incarnating his I in the physical body. This was a separation from the divine, from the spiritual world, a darkening of his consciousness. And now we can understand that, in fact, by doing so, the human being has made a sacrifice. For with the sacrifice, the human being has prepared their body, the human body, to become a vehicle so that the Christ could finally incarnate at the baptism in the Jordan. Thus, without this progressive descent into materiality of the human I in the astral body, in the etheric body, and even in the death of the physical body, it would not have been possible to bring about this series of events described in the genealogy of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, which ultimately led to Jesus of Nazareth and to the possibility of Christ incarnating at the baptism in the Jordan. So let's keep in mind that the descent into materiality of the human being is a sacrifice that will allow Christ to fulfill the mystery of Golgotha. And from this, we go to the 12th and last lecture to conclude this cycle.